This afternoon's session, the Strategic Outlook, Challenges in the South and East China Seas and the broader Indo-Pacific, Regional Quad Partners Perspectives. It's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers this afternoon, but before I do so, I'd just like to make some commentary in relation to the well-known story that those who fail to study the lessons of military history are doomed to repeat the mistakes. And I think if we need to go back and have a look at a significant part of the military history that has led to the situation in the affecting our strategic outlook in the South and East China Seas, it would have to be the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. And I'm sure that all the members in uniform will put their hand up and say yes, they're well versed in that particular war. But it really is interesting to go back and have a look at that. It started in Korea, and it was really a conflict between Japan and China over the influence in Korea. And then it got bigger and larger and more deadly, in the extent that the Japanese Navy absolutely decimated a fairly modern Chinese naval force. The Chinese army was defeated, and it led to a widespread partly colonisation of China by European countries, by Russia, and in particular by Japan. And in fact, Japan occupied Taiwan as part of that war, and continued to occupy it up until 1945. But more importantly, what that war did is it allowed the Chinese Communist Party to raise very, very clearly and loudly within the Chinese community the way the European countries, Russia and Japan, had treated them in that war, and has led to large-scale nationalism within China. It also led to a complete reversal of the Confucius outlook in the Southeast China area, where China had been the prominent and dominant country for several thousands of years, and all of a sudden that whole situation was reversed when the Japanese, who were known, publicly known, and a very derogatory term by the Chinese leaders at the time as dwarfs, completely smashed the Chinese military. And I think if you look carefully at that particular history, you will see that China has ever since been fighting to reverse that change in the Confucian order, where it became the second state and Japan was the number one nation. It's my great pleasure to talk about from defence to deterrence, Japan's shifting security posture, Dr. Lauren Richardson, who's the lecturer at Coralbell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Department of International Relations at the Australian National University, and her research focus has been focusing on the role of the non-state actors in shaping diplomatic interactions in Northeast Asia, particularly Japan-Korea relations. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction and for the framing remarks about the Sino-Japanese War, which I'll come back to in a moment. I'm really delighted to be speaking with you all today at this event, and thank you so much to RUSI for organising it. It's a real honour to be among such great speakers and also such an impressive audience. So I started studying Japanese when I was 12 years old, when I began high school actually in Melbourne, and continued with that for many years through to university, where I also studied Korean and ended up spending 6 years living in Japan, mostly studying and doing research, and also a year in South Korea. So I'm happy to, I work on Korean Peninsula Japan relations, as you just heard in the introduction, so happy to take questions later on Korea as well, or the two Koreas, but today I'll be talking about Japan. So the title of my talk today is from Defense to Deterrence, Japan's Shifting Security Posture. as I'm sure you all know, and you've actually heard in the earlier session today, under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan played a leading role in defining the Indo-Pacific region and articulating some of the well-known norms that we associate with it today, such as free and open Indo-Pacific, and also its key institutions, such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad. So this has meant that Japan has emerged as a regional leader in the management of strategic tensions in the Indo-Pacific, which is the title of today's dialogue. And in many ways you could say Japan is a kind of architect of the Indo-Pacific. So in my remarks today, I'll be looking at how and why Japan came to assume this role. It's easy to just take that for granted, or just something Japan came to do. But if we look at the evolution of Japan's security posture and its defence policy, it's actually quite extraordinary that Japan was able to step up and play such a prominent role. It's not simply the case that, Japan has the diplomatic resources, the security resources to play such a role. If we look at South Korea, for instance, it has the 10th biggest economy in the world, the 6th biggest military, but it hasn't stepped out to play a role like that. Okay, it also has very similar security concerns to Japan, but for many reasons hasn't been proactive in trying to shape the region in accordance with its interests. So it's not something we can just assume a country with considerable capacity like Japan would just automatically do. Okay, so I'll argue that today that Japan has come to take on the sort of role that Japan has assumed in the Indo-Pacific actually represents a fundamental shift in Japan's security posture. It's a shift from a purely defence-oriented posture to a deterrence-oriented one. And this deterrence posture, as you can imagine, is mostly geared toward China. Okay, I'll get into why that's the case. And it's been termed a kind of historical inflection point in Japan, and has been characterised by the development of offensive capabilities, okay, which were long regarded as a kind of no-go zone in Japan's defence policy. Also counter-strike capabilities, bolstering of defence capabilities on Japan's own accord. Okay, they're not just taking cues from the United States as they have done in the past. And I argue that there's three major factors that have kind of precipitated and facilitated this shift. It's not just China. One is that there's been extensive institutional change in Japan's defence establishment that really began in the late Cold War, long before Prime Minister Abe, particularly in relation to constitutional interpretation and security legislation. There's also been, the second factor is there's been considerable changes in Japan's security environment. Obviously, a lot of these changes have been noted by Australia as well, and are also driving Australia's strategic overhaul. But there's also some subtle differences. And there's also, in talking about the strategic environment, obviously the main factor has been the unprecedented build-up in China's military strength, particularly its navy, which has been worrying to Japan, and also the challenges that China and now Russia are posing for the regional and international dimensions of the rules-based order. This has led to a recognition that Japan's security environment is as severe and complex as it was at the end of World War II. And we actually heard that same remark being made about Australia in the oration this morning. So you can see there's considerable overlap in our strategic outlooks. And the third factor I would mention is Shinzo Abe's leadership tenure. It was of unprecedented length. He's the longest reigning Prime Minister in Japan. And I think if he hadn't served such a long role, Japan, again, may not have played such a prominent role in defining the Indo-Pacific as it did. And I think if you take away any of those three factors, even one of them, again, we wouldn't have seen this real step up by Japan in the region. Okay, So I don't think I need to explain to an audience with a lot of expertise in this area that Japan after World War II was really saddled with a pacifist constitution that really meant that it wasn't even really supposed to maintain defense forces, and it really adopted a new identity as a result, where it thought we're going to be an economic power, we're going to be totally reliant on the US for security, and we'll just put all our resources into economic development. And that really explains why Japan catapulted, its economy catapulted and began to rival the US's eventually. But things began to change. This wasn't going to always just continually work for Japan. We see in the late Cold War period that Japan began to, I guess, normalize as a security actor, okay? Up to this point, throughout the 1980s, it was even considered ridiculous for scholars in universities, say in the US, to talk about Japan's security policy, as I'm doing today, because everyone just assumed they're just a kind of puppet of the United States. They're a client state. They don't have a security posture or security policy to speak of. But it really very gradually began to change. In the second phase of the Cold War, Japan became concerned about the rise of Soviet military capabilities in the Northwest Pacific. And then in the 1990s, Japan began to participate in a non-combat way in UN peacekeeping missions. The context for this was, of course, the Persian Gulf crisis. And Japan, at the time, because it had become an economic heavyweight, started to receive a lot of international criticism that it wasn't playing a commensurate military role, one that was commensurate with its economic weight. And instead, Japan was just contributing finances to support those efforts, and it was thus criticised for its checkbook diplomacy. It's important to realise that all of these changes that started happening weren't easily ushered in. Almost every single time Japanese policymakers had to engage in what's been called intellectual acrobatics in trying to reinterpret this pacifist constitution that really forbade Japan from engaging in any kind of military effort. So each time there was a push to set new precedents, new norms, to give Japan some leverage back as a security actor. And then we see from the late 1980s, Japan started providing rear area support for US military contingencies that could potentially affect Japan's security interests. And the context here was the North Korean nuclear crisis and its development of ballistic missiles. There was also the Taiwan Strait crisis, and then followed by 9/11. At the same time, the US was really urging Japan to carry more of the strategic burden in the alliance, and it had to really begin stepping up. From 2004-2006, we see the deployment of self-defense forces from Japan in Iraq to help with reconstruction efforts, and that was in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. So very gradually, Japan started emerging as a security actor. So Japan's strategic environment has always been quite adverse since the end of World War II. These are some quotes that I picked up when, not sort of quotes, but just pieces of information from interviewing defense officials in Japan. It's sort of how they narrate their strategic environment. That obviously Japan has a considerable population, 120 million, and much of that population is sort of concentrated in a couple of major cities, mostly Osaka and Tokyo, and it's one of the most densely populated countries, and therefore it's very vulnerable to attacks. Obviously, with North Korean missiles a major concern. Japan has this natural barrier of the ocean, but in the age of these long-range missiles, that's increasingly not considered a barrier. Japan also has very few natural resources and is dependent on food and energy from outside, and this is partly what fed into Abe's concept of the importance of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan, this is where it differs from Australia. Its strategic environment has extremely fraught relations with all of its near neighbours. Okay, it has territorial disputes with China, with Russia, with South Korea. It also has a lot of historical baggage with all of those countries. And diplomatic relations are also very strained with all of those countries. We're slowly seeing a rapprochement between South Korea and Japan, but that's likely to remain an unstable relationship. And in terms of the growing security concerns, and this was again came from defense officials that I interviewed. When you look at Japan's defense papers, official defense papers, you often get a sense that North Korea and China are sort of equally weighted as threats, but that's not the case in actuality. One defense official said Japan has 3 major security challenges. The first is China, the second is China, the third is China. It didn't say anything more. North Korea wasn't even mentioned until we brought it up. And the point here is obviously that the China threat or the China problem for Japan is an incredibly complex one. It's not one problem, as it is for, I think, Australia as well. So again, North Korea is, of course, a big problem in Japan's security environment, and another reason why it has really ventured into trying to have a leadership role in regional security to also shape this threat. Interestingly, though, you don't really get the perception in Japan that Japanese leaders or policymakers or bureaucrats actually think that North Korea is going to launch a nuclear strike on Japan. That's not really what the concern is. I think everyone in Japan sort of has the view that that would be the end of North Korea, and that's not what North Korea wants. They actually spoke more of this threat as, this peninsula that's right next door to us is a tinderbox. Okay, it's kind of like the Balkans, like an unresolved geostrategic problem. It was never meant to be permanently divided. The Korean War was meant to end. It never did. North Korea has a formidable army, and so does South Korea. And as I said, we often think of South Korea and Japan as quasi-allies because they're both allies of the United States, but we often downplay the extent to which both countries regard each other as a threat. There's not a lot of trust between the two countries. And so there's a concern that if war erupts on the peninsula again, and that's not out of the question, we know that Trump was actually planning to launch a limited strike on North Korea. That wasn't just an actual rumour. That there will be thousands of US troops involved, there'll be ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads. There'll also be a lot of Japan's contingency planning focuses on the prospect of huge refugee flow from North Korea to Japan. A lot of unvaccinated people. Japan's very phobic about tuberculosis, which is at times rampant in North Korea. So there's also that human security sort of aspect to the threat. And since 1953, there's been a lot of, skirmishes here and there, sometimes involving deaths of US soldiers, but no war on the peninsula. So the challenge for Japan is how can we kind of maintain this strategic tranquility. So you get a sense from this that there is that other difference with Australia when we're looking at Japan's strategic outlook. So now we come to Abe Shinzo, who he sort of came to lead Japan after a revolving door of prime ministers. And this is why we'll have new prime ministers every year. Someone commented to me earlier that it's often very hard to remember the name of Japanese prime ministers because they were changing over all the time. Even Abe had a short first stint and then came back for a second term and became the longest serving prime minister in Japan. And I think if it wasn't for that really long term, and also for Abe's vision, he was a much more outward-looking prime minister than many other Japanese prime ministers have been. Obviously, Japan's got economic stagnation, so former prime ministers have focused on trying to relieve that. That he really turned his focus outwards and, decided that the US-Japan alliance, although it's still the cornerstone of Japan's foreign and security policy, it's no longer enough to deter China. That was the realization. Just because we're, allied with the most powerful military in the world, if we look at what China's doing, this may not be enough to deter China. And it was really that thought that encouraged Abe to try to network the US alliance with Japan, more into the Indo-Pacific region by strengthening partnerships with India, Australia. We're going to hear those regional outlooks next. And to really layer this arrangement with trilateral partnerships and relationships and the Quad, exactly. So we've heard earlier about his speech. He really talked about the confluence of the two seas. Obviously, the South China Sea connects those two seas as well, and I think that was really a focus of his speech at the time. He then wrote an op-ed in the Project Syndicate that became the sort of intellectual foundation for the Quad. Okay, and then in 2016, really worked with the US later to develop this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that it was going to have this normative thrust to it. So again, he continued really trying to institutionalize his vision for the Indo-Pacific, often working very closely with the US, promoting the establishment of law, freedom, navigation. There's a great paper by Kay Cogger who talks about how Abe was, at first calling it strategy, just always trying to test the waters of how other countries would react to this, but when facing concerns by ASEAN, sort of changed it to vision and, kept things fluid that way. Obviously, it was a strategy for him. He had a strategic vision, but just wanted to make sure he didn't alienate so-called, potential like-minded partners in the region. Australia really fits into this strategy as one of those like-minded partners who has quite a similar strategic outlook to Japan. It's not identical. As you've seen, there's some significant differences. And we've seen the gradual institutionalization of this relationship. Particularly what's of interest is the defense partnership. Australia is now really Japan's second most important defense partner. So just to wrap up, I think we can't take for granted the role that Japan was able to play, this role as a kind of architect of the Indo-Pacific. It never would have happened if Abe's predecessors hadn't sort of really pushed the boundary of the constitution and what Japan's able to do. Abe then came in and enacted some new security legislation. It's really too hard to change the constitution in Japan, so he legislated around it to give Japan certain freedoms like comprehensive, defense and being able to, work with the US, potentially in certain ways to, in certain contingencies that they could actually work together, which again had been considered unthinkable before. And then, so the other issue was, of course, the significant changes in Japan's security environment, which has really urged Abe to make the most of his long tenure to really institutionalize some changes. And when he was very tragically assassinated, there was a lot of confusion about what his legacy was and what it wasn't. He didn't achieve a lot of his big-term ambitions, but I think the one thing we can say about his legacy is that he fundamentally changed Japan's security posture in a way that it would be hard to move back from, and in a way that it's quite easy for his successor to carry on with tending the Quad and other institutions that he really helped to set up. So thank you for your attention. Look forward to your questions later.